Hi there. I'm going to walk you through my thoughts on the annotated bibliography. As I mentioned in the last recording I made for you, I'm moving away from a traditional annotated bibliography in order to hopefully provide you with a mechanism for making, and keeping better annotations, and for also developing the skill of being able to read strategically, given that we live in a world filled with text, especially historians. So I want to work very quickly on just a little bit of what we can do with Tom Griffith's introduction to his book, The Art of Time Travel. Okay, so this book, I just love the book. It's filled with great profiles on Australian historians that Tom Griffith particularly has admired and been influenced by over his long career. He's now an emeritus professor with ANU, which is sort of like Australia's premier university. He's had a great career, and he's been able to retire young enough to keep on writing many books for at least another 20 years. He's not much older than me, but being a good lad and a serious academic, he's worked all his life, whereas I've spent much of my life in service projects doing stuff for virtually nothing for many, many, many years. So as you can see here, I've been slowly moving down. I've highlighted the first line or so of this, just to get me warmed up and start using this highlighting tool up here. Okay, so highlighting tool, turn it on. I can come over here and I can highlight anything that stands out for me. One of the things that you'll notice about this particular reading, and not all readings are like this, you'll notice that Griffith's style is that of in this particular context, a raconteur. He's telling a story. He's recounting. That's what raconteur means. It's a French word, and we probably all know people whose personality is drawn to the story. They can make a funny story out of, the cat getting stuck in the cat door going outside, or somebody tripping over on the road, and that sort of stuff. Anything can be turned into an incredible story. I've certainly known a couple of absolutely wonderful raconteurs in my life. I wouldn't count myself as one of them, but I can still tell a reasonably good story. But for Griffith, it comes naturally, and I think that's a defining element of his whole writing as a historian. It's not as light and easy flowing as this if you were to pull up one of his serious academic books, but it is something that is defining of this. So here he is. He's on a walk in rural France, so a pilgrimage, as he says, and there are many pilgrimage roads or routes through the south of France to Compostela, for instance, in the north of Spain, where you walk from somewhere on just near the Riviera across the Pyrenees through into northern Spain and through the Basque country and across. And that's the sort of thing that this guy's often doing. And, it's something that French people take very seriously, but many people from all over the world. In fact, one good friend of mine has done this particular pilgrimage 3 times. Taking her atheist husband with her, and he's thoroughly enjoyed it too, because it's not just a inverted commas spiritual thing or religious thing. It's actually a deeply cultural and moving experience, just because it is beautiful, great food, great views, you name it, it's fantastic. And so that's where he starts off, and he tells this story about meeting these French guys, and they ask him, who's your favourite historians? So he's known, Ferdinand Brondel, who's a giant of 20th century history. He wrote Social History, which is exactly the area that Griffiths works in. It's not the history of battles and kings and queens, it's the history of social processes and the life ways of people. Then he says that he also mentions this guy Larourie, and he says it's like striking gold somewhere further down. Okay, so he sets the scene. Okay, but then he tells us what? This book is quirky and serious and personal exploration of the art and the craft of history in Australia since the Second World War. So he tells us where it's at. So that little prologue to this prologue, you could say, is so that he can tell us what he's going to be doing in this text. Now, you can be marking through like that, but I am not a napalm marker. You know, you don't do that sort of thing. It's useless. It doesn't help you when you return to a reading. You've got to be marking quite strategically. So Control Z makes that go away. But, you know, to mark those two particular historians, well worth keeping, going back, I don't need that. So I can get rid of that bit there. And I don't need this either. Really, that's not needed either. So I'm showing you how my brain works. But, you know, when I'm reading strategically. I'm skimming down, you know, and I'm not reading in that kind of struggling, focused way. Good history is a high wire, gravity-defying act of balance and grace that fills me with awe. I can say that is true for myself, but to read it in that clunky way kind of soaks up your energy. By 10 or 15 minutes of reading, you have to go down and lie down on the couch or go for a walk with the dog or something. But, you know, when you read, I know that stuff between the Second World War and that point that I just read is lighter. Okay, he's telling us what he's going to do, but we're not necessarily going to read the book. So he's telling us he's going to talk about his favourite historians, right? Historians tend to be dedicated, passionate citizens. In other words, we are part of the civic culture of the world we inhabit. Good point. To make a difference, we try to make a difference by telling true stories. So this question of true is a really important one. So I actually not only highlighted that, but I actually copied it and dropped it into a Word document over here. Okay, there's the Word document. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this little CLA bit in a moment. So quotations that impress me. So the first thing I'm doing when I'm reading this is I'm looking for things that stand out for me. Oh, I did that drawing because I've actually also been practicing with this gorgeous thing where I can go and muck around with it. But I'm not going to be doing that for you. That was more for something else that I just wanted to play with it. So I'm going to, guess what? Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. The point is to make a text accessible, okay? So what are historians doing? Well, we begin with their inquiries in a deeply felt present. Now, this thing for Griffith is actually really important. That word felt, for him, is a word that speaks, I guess, to his authentic engagement with the life worlds of different times and places, and certainly of the authors that he's looking at here. So, you know, there's another great historian, Mark Bloch, okay, is a famous Jew, fought in the resistance, was killed by the Gestapo in 1944. Historians, sometimes, you know, it's quite a dangerous job. So I, on my own shelf, have this particular one, which I have had since 1980 or 1979. I forget which year I bought it. Double volume set. It is quintessential mid-20th century, what does he call it up here? High wire, gravity defying, okay? It is beautifully written, okay? So I've had that, and in the distant past, when I used to be a very focused historian, now I'm more of a cultural worker and futurist in many respects, with my roots in the historical. You know, I used to use those sorts of books, okay? So he's talking about the historian's craft. He's skimming down. I'm not reading any of that stuff, you know. Then I get down to historians. So I pay more attention to what I called, you know, the what's the word for it? Topic sentences in paragraphs, okay? And we need to challenge ourselves, okay? So this is really, really important. The first thing that we have to deal with is our own biases, our own prejudices, and the echo chambers we inhabit. Social media has made that particularly apparent, I guess. But for me, it's a matter of, okay, I'm looking for certain things, but I've got to keep my mind open. And as an historian, also as a culturalist, and also as a futurist, I need to do that. And as an educator too, I need to do that. As, let's say, we're forced into communicating like this now in COVID times. But actually, I would never have done this as a recording. I would have done it in a tutorial, and if you weren't there, well, bad luck. And so now we've got a record of this too, so it's going to be useful in that sense. So here we are, we're skimming along the uses and abuses of Australian history, street and skimming down. I'm just skimming. I literally am, because I deliberately left this reading for a week or two since I looked at it last, and I deliberately got rid of or cleaned up my act with it. So I pulled out all this markings in it. So I'm going down now. History is I'm looking for definitions. That tends to be subtle, humble, complex, contextual, and therefore less amenable to generalization, prediction, or application. Phrase like that, you could think about that for quite some time. I could ask you all to write your final essay on that question. Unpack, engage with, and discuss Tom Griffith's definition of history as a form of knowledge. It's subtle. That means a lot of grey. It's not black and white. History is never black and white. Okay, it's humble. It doesn't sort of brag about things. It's not those glorious, arrogant histories from the 19th and first half of the 20th century, or from fascist countries where they, or the populist histories. For instance, Australia's produced a few as well. We tend to be more self-deprecating. In other words, we tend to make fun of ourselves. But serious histories from the conservative right of history writing from America, from European countries, and from England, for instance, as well as from countries that tend to be non-democratic. I'm trying to think of a reasonably politically correct word. They can be somewhat bragging and so on. But good history is a form of knowing, should be humble. In other words, we're always open to an alternative. Show me the evidence, as Carr would say in his What is History little book. Show us the evidence and we will change our minds, okay? Or we will go and weigh that evidence up. We'll measure it with this and this and this, and we'll test it. So it's complex. That means we're always working across the board and trying to negotiate in understanding and meaning from all the elements we've got there, because there might be big chunks missing, especially if the history is from long ago. And it's contextual. Therefore, if you're going to be a historian of the Tudor period of England, that's the Henry VII and VIII and the brats in between, and then Elizabeth, okay, the first, that period is a very clearly defined period, because we had the Reformation, we had Civil War, we had the emergence of the Protestant Reformation, we had all these things locked in there, okay? And so that means that the context binding nature of those elements mean that we can't necessarily generalize from that period to now, though we could say there are similarities. The kind of tensions in the world of the Elizabethan period, let's say, that Tudor period, are just as real as the tension today. Who are we? Protestant, Catholic, a Reformed Catholic? Or are you, and what kind of Protestant might you be? Because Protestants went pretty wild, out there. They were coming up with all sorts of very dangerous ideas. The Anglicanism Anglican lasted for a little while, and of course it's still today. But, from that, suddenly people were allowed to think for themselves. Literacy was going, the Bible was being printed, people were able to read for the first time. It's just like computer literacy is increasing. People are now on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can Google the information you want, whether it's right or wrong. Wikipedia's there. We got all that stuff, but how do we navigate it? Where are we going? Who am I in all of this? And how does it destabilize my sense of self? It's no wonder we've got huge anxieties, mental health issues going on at the moment. COVID just makes it worse. But, we've got people spreading conspiracy theories about COVID all over the place. And that's destabilising the knowledge base. We've got governments seeking to leverage COVID so that they can actually surveil and control us, the citizens, more than they used to, and it's all legitimate because it's in our best interest, So we have a paternalistic sort of approach emerging. Whew. I can say, well, there are so many similarities between the Tudor period and the current period, all right? And both periods were worried about the soul, or let's say, what's going to happen next. Heaven and hell back then climate change today, post-climate change, or what's going to happen with climate change, post-COVID. The people, I'm actually giving a talk this evening about the post-COVID context, but partly as well, who's going to say there's a post-COVID? Was there ever a post-Black Death in medieval and the Tudor period? Because the Black Death, the last major Black Death plague hit England in the 1660s and 70s, okay? So it didn't go away for centuries, because when it hit Europe in 1348, of course it had hit China and India and the Persian Empire area as well before this, okay? And it stayed, and it stayed. The last cases of bubonic plague were recorded about 4 decades ago. Apparently, it's gone quiet. But then a case will pop up here or there, okay? Because the bacteria, the bacilli that create bubonic plague, or we contract it from them, is alive and well in the dust of somebody's apartment or whatever it is. So I'm back to skimming down here. History, by contrast, spills over with illuminating verifiable examples. I think, well, verifiable examples. We've got to be able to prove what we say. Goes back to what he said before about true. Okay? It's a true story. Okay? Or a truthful story. History's commitment to contingency and particularity, okay? Historians welcome questions. I love questions. That's why we call this course Questioning History, about its usefulness. Oh, is history useful? I mean, looking at the way our current government's wanting to fund the humanities vis-a-vis the useful areas like nursing and so on. Of course, I know half of you are probably education students, and I think you're not going to be hit with that particular hike. But if you're a Bachelor of Arts student wanting to become a history prof, you're going to pay double what you would have paid before COVID and before a whole bunch of changes brought about by our current government. Okay, blah, blah, blah. I'm just skimming down, and I could miss things. I accept that. There's a certain risk, especially if you're like me now, rabbiting on in this odd little room here. And I'm going to try and do more recordings from home because it feels a little, at least I feel more grounded, I guess. You may be spotting things there that I'm not, but let's say, this is one of my favourite lines. This is why historians cultivate wonder as a technical skill. Wonder is a mechanism by which we might make the familiar strange. That's core to all my work. We can't just assume that this mode of delivery to you is the new normal. It is actually quite remarkable, but not just is it remarkable, the technology itself is the remarkable. The technology that links you in some other space in another time, because this is not synchronous, it's asynchronous, it's out of time with one another. But at the same time, there's a certain personal presence, which is really important for the delivery of any form of teaching, okay, is that I'm delivering this to you. So let's say I've zoomed down here, I've done that, but I just so like that. Copy the text, pull up my little Word doc, drop it in here, Control V, put a full stop there and find the page number because I forgot to check, page 5. All right, done. So that's the sort of thing I want you to do. Obviously, I don't want you to carry on major conversations while you're doing this. I'm keeping my eye also on the page numbers up here. I'm in the middle of the reading now. We're getting down to the real juicy parts of it. Okay, so we've got other things going on here, but I don't want necessarily to spend much time. This is interesting, talking about time. Okay, so historians tend to not think about time. We do to some extent in this course, particularly with a couple of the readings in the middle of or the second half of the course. We take time for granted, even though it is their medium. It is our medium, time. Time flows on. It dictates chronology. It lazily supplies causation. Yes, this happened before that, so they must be linked. Okay. He goes on and develops that. So I will be thinking, I'm going to actually read that until at least I get down to block, okay? So I'm going to read that. It relentlessly propels us into the future, okay? So it's a driver. Temporality drives, snatching the present from us. It goes into the past, okay? Making the present strange. The past strange, sorry. In spite of this apparent agency, the agency of time and our own agency within time, we often assume that time is an inert and flat and without form, colour or contours. But time speeds up and slows down, okay? This COVID period, for some, like me, it sped up. It just, so many other things started happening simultaneously. For others in full lockdown, like my whole family are down in Melbourne at the moment. They're all locked down. You can't even go from one suburb to the next unless you have a note from the doctor or something. So for other people, it's actually slowed down. And that sense of time is a visceral sense. That means it's a feeling sense. Okay, but I'm going to stop there and jump back to the second point I want to make, which is a little bit about this CLA stuff that I touched on. CLA, causal layered analysis, I think it can be a useful way for us to start analysing and thinking about how to do an annotated bibliography that might sort of reveal more of itself to you. So the litany for Tom Griffith is the elements of his story, his narrative. He's walking, he mentions names, that's always at the litany, Mark Bloch, Ferdinand Brondel, and so on. These are people you've probably never heard of, right? But they go in the litany just because that's the dusting that says, hey, I actually know something about this. And you could put down titles of books. You could put down any other elements that really are not key to what he's talking about, but they're the surface stuff that you have to manage very well. Why? Because at the systems level, there's a narrative, there's a story. You've got to be clear. You want people to know exactly where you are in your writing. And he's the elements of his work are storytelling, clarity, humor, narrative structure, and so on. Okay, but he's building it in his analytical stuff is a sense of a dialogue first with the French people, but really his dialogue is with you, the reader, with me, the reader. Okay, in which through dialogue he is actually demonstrating his own deeper assumptions or beliefs about historical method and process, which gets us down to the worldview stuff. Truth is relative, okay? That means it's context bound. Maybe I'm looking at that, okay, I did put that in. Where's the one back here? Taking time for granted, no, this one, that one. So I'm going to copy that now. Having read that, and my brain goes link, draw the dots. Connect the dots, should I say, not draw them, connect them, Control V, and it was page 4. So I put it in like that. So yes, it is. Time is relative, it's all context bound, but it's not beyond reach. In other words, there's a sense of telling true stories, okay? True stories, okay? So we have accuracy, the facts, the evidence need to be accurate as far as we know, but it's always as far as we know. No one living today was alive during the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Okay? It's gone. We have evidence, we have a lot of written material, but it comes from very selective sources. The Catholics hated Elizabeth, so they wrote certain things about her. Her relationship with her cousin, for instance, Mary, Queen of Scots, okay? Was tense, okay? Jump across. Her work with reformers was sometimes tense as well. The Church of England people themselves loved it and loved her. There's a lot of jaunty nationalist stuff. She smashes the Spanish Armada, for instance. There's the records from the Star Chamber, which was the kind of parliamentary process that she established that brought lessened centralised authority, because the belief in the absolute will and right of a king or a queen, a monarch, to make the call on all matters of state was being challenged. It came to a head 2 generations after Elizabeth, when it was Charles I. James succeeded her. He was a mad Scotsman. His son succeeded him. And the Scots were living about a century behind the Brits in terms of their political thinking and their aspirations. And Charles got his head cut off because we had the English Civil War, right? Because he was trying to assert the right of the king to make all the calls, okay? And that just didn't go down very well, especially with a bunch of Puritans around who were all reading the Bible and saying, hang on a second, this is not the way we should be governing. And they made us sure to make changes that have still stayed with the British monarchy all the way through to today. Of course, vast changes, but essentially we now had a parliamentary monarchy, not an autocratic monarchy in Britain, all right? So that's the sort of stuff that I'm talking about here. So accuracy and rigor, that means we follow a historical method. More about that later. We are committed to honesty, not fabrication. So this week's reading, where you're looking at the history on trial, okay, that's where honesty comes in. Self-reflection, yeah, I know that I'm actually committed to a certain take on gender in history in Australia, but I'm going to balance that with the evidence. Okay, you must. The evidence determines the degree to which you can tell a story, and a story that is historically and factually accurate. But we need this. We need imagination. So these are all elements, this sense of wonder and awe. I'm going to put that in there because I think that's equally important, sense of wonder and awe, okay? And one other point that comes from that is that the present is seen as remarkable. Okay, so, and then looking for the metaphor that's in Griffiths' work, and it's a very clear metaphor for Griffiths, it's the time machine or time travel. The book is called Time Travel. It uses the term time travel, so time travel, time machine. This is the foggy, spongy stuff, but it's really important stuff as well, because we live by our metaphors or by our deep stories, by our deep myths, you could say. Sometimes with CLA, it goes like this, myth/metaphor, okay? And the deep story is, let's say, A Stitch in Time Saves Nine, the Cinderella stories. All cultures have the Ugly Duckling story. Maybe one of us or a couple of us in this group might feel that we've always been the ugly duckling. We've always been the person on the outside. We never quite fitted in, okay? And the promise of the ugly duckling stories, of course, is that sooner or later, suddenly, Mum and Dad are going to suddenly think that I see me for my worth. They're going to come to value my qualities. Or suddenly I'm going to actually blossom as an academic and write HD essays when I'm always seem to miss the mark with my essays. But maybe it's because your interests are not quite clearly aligned, that you actually want to work in another area. Or maybe it's just that you're doing this because you've been told, suffer now and later on you'll get a job and you'll be able to have a Pajero like the lady next door, okay? Duh. It's, however we tell our stories. But for this particular writer, Tom Griffiths, his metaphor is very much clearly that historians are time travelers, so we have the time machine. And the time machine is the historical method, a whole lot of heart, wonder and awe. So that's what I would like you to create over the next few weeks. I want 3 or 4 of these, possibly, by I think it's week 4 that you have to hand in a small selection. At least let's go for 3. Let's see if you could work on 3 of these. So if you're thinking about this week's reading, History on Trial, well, the myth metaphor is the courtroom. It's not hard to come across myth metaphors when you know how to look for them, but I suspect we're going to be spending a little more time on that. So I click save. I close that one down, say bye-bye. I pull up my this guy, and I invite you to keep working your way through it over the next few days. See what else you can pull out from that. Create your own CLA and apply it to this week's reading, History on Trial. Okay, and I'll see you in the virtual world on Friday. Come prepared to talk, come prepared to engage, okay? This is a course where even the quiet people on the very edges of the room who don't want to say anything usually, I turn to them and say, okay, what do you think? Okay, and I expect you to engage, and I'm also expecting you to be visible on the screen. You know, have your cameras on wherever possible. That means I expect you to be clothed. I had a near miss the other day. Friday, I had some Brazilian people joining me for a talk, non a USC talk. It was my HDR PhD students, and I invited a group of people along to listen to this guy. And this lady was in her nightie because it was 2 o'clock in the morning. She got up, but her nightie was very revealing, and I had to turn her off. So yes, no nighties, please. No nudity. Just a lot of good humour and a lot of preparedness to engage, and that would be just truly awesome. So I'll see you soon, and I'll put this up. Hope it's useful for you. Thanks. Bye.